Many of you might know the British Army's 24th Regiment of Foot from the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. 5 companies of the 1st Battalion and 1 of the 2nd were wiped out by the Zulus at the Battle of Isandlwana, whilst B Company of the 2nd Battalion provided the backbone and were awarded 7 Victoria Crosses at the defence of Rorke's Drift, made famous in the film Zulu. But did you know that they also participated in the British infantry's own version of the Charge of the Light Brigade, charging entrenched cannon with just their bayonets? Well, that's exactly what they did at the Battle of Chillianwala in India in 1849. In that brave, bloody and largely forgotten charge against the Sikh artillery, they lost 500 men killed or wounded, half their regiment. They also lost one of their colours, one of only 4 occasions this happened to a British regiment during the Victorian period. Incredibly, they lost them again in 1879, the only regiment to achieve that dubious honour in Queen Victoria's long reign. So what exactly happened there at the forgotten Battle of Chillianwala? And were the 24th Regiment of Foot the unluckiest regiment in the history of the British Army? The regiment had their origins back in the 17th century, when a Member of Parliament from Kent, Sir Edward Dering, had raised a regiment to support the Williamite War in Ireland. Later on they'd fight at the Battle of Blenheim. They would then lose half their numbers to disease and enemy fire in the West Indies, where they fought in the British disastrous defeat at Cartagena de Indias during the War of Jenkins' Ear. Sir Edward Dering's Regiment of Foot were designated the 24th Regiment of Foot in 1751, and 30 years later were, along with other regiments, given a geographical location, in their case the 2nd Warwickshires. By then they'd been part of the British surrender to the French on the island of Minorca, and during the American War of Independence the whole regiment had been captured during the Saratoga campaign. During the wars with revolutionary France they'd fought in Egypt in 1801, and in recognition of the courage displayed were awarded a Sphinx as their regimental badge. The 24th then fought with Wellington at the Battle of Talavera, where they lost over 40% of their men killed or wounded. Then just a few years later, half the regiment, about 400 men, were captured whilst on a troop convoy in the Indian Ocean during the Napoleonic War, and spent a year as prisoners of the French on the island of Mauritius. They had arrived in India as part of normal garrison duty in 1848, but their arrival coincided with the outbreak of the Second Anglo Sikh War, and on the 13th of January 1849 they found themselves advancing with bayonets fixed against the Sikh artillery at the Battle of Chillianwala. This is the 6th episode that I've produced about the wars between the British East India Company and the Sikh-ruled Empire of Punjab. So if you want to go back into any more detail, please check them out. I've posted links to the other 5 videos in the description below. However, just to put this particular story into context, here is a very quick summary of events. The expanding British Empire in India, operated by the East India Company, came up against the Sikh-ruled Kingdom of Punjab in the 1840s. The First Anglo-Sikh War had been fought over 3 months at the end of 1845 into 1846. The British forces, made up of units from the regular British Army and Indian sepoys, under veteran General Sir Hugh Gough, had eventually triumphed after a series of particularly bloody battles with the well-armed and ferocious Sikhs. Those battles were made all the more bloody by Gough's preference to take on his enemies with bayonet charges, even though the Sikhs possessed muskets and cannon. In the end, the Sikh Army was defeated, but only due to the treachery of some of their leaders. The ensuing peace treaty had maintained nominal Sikh independence, but with British officials assisting the governance of the Punjab. It didn't take long for tensions, especially from the Sikhs who believed that never really lost in the first place, to resurface. A revolt broke out in the town of Multan in 1848 and rapidly spread across the Punjab. Once more, a British Indian army under General Gough was dispatched into the country, this time with the aim of snuffing out independence and annexing the region into the British Empire. In November 1848, Gough met the Sikh army under Sher Singh Atariwala at the Battle of Ramnagar. In an inconclusive encounter, Sher Singh was able to blunt Gough's attack before withdrawing in good order, having captured a British gun. Sher Singh now moved north to the Jhelum River, about 85 miles northwest of the Punjab capital at Lahore, hoping to join up with his own father's army. On the 10th of January 1849, Gough heard that Sher's father, Chattar Singh, had finally captured the fortress at Attock in northwest Punjab after its garrison had come over to him. He was now able to bring his forces to join his son. Keen to prevent the two forces uniting, and being urged by the Governor-General and his political superior, Lord Dalhousie, to produce a victory, Gough advanced. At around midday on the 13th of January, he reached the village of Chillianwala. Having cleared a Sikh picket, Gough was able to ascend a mound, and in front of him he saw the whole of Sher's army in battle formation. If there was a saving grace, it was that his father's army hadn't yet arrived. The British claimed that the Sikh army opposing them was anywhere between 20 and 30,000 strong. Some Sikhs, however, claimed that their army was much smaller. So small, in fact, maybe 10,000, that it was actually outnumbered by the British. This army included members of the Sikh Army, the Khalsa, more men who'd fought in the previous war with the British, and about 5,000 Gurchara irregular cavalry. They also possessed 65 guns, although they were of a lighter calibre than the ones deployed by the Khalsa in the First Anglo Sikh War. Whatever the exact numbers of men in the army, the Sikhs had positioned themselves in a strong fortified line, defended by their cannon, stretching nearly 6 miles from the village of Russell on their left, close to the river. In front of their positions lay scrubby jungle, with some bushes growing to a height of over 8 feet. It would take something special to dislodge them, and I wonder what tactic Sir Hugh Gough had up his sleeve. Major General Sir Hugh Gough's army numbered approximately 14,000 men and 62 cannon. They included 3 British infantry regiments, the 29th Foot, the 61st Foot, and the 24th Foot, later the South Wales Borderers. Also present were 3 British Army cavalry regiments, the 3rd King's Own Light Dragoons, the 9th Queen's Light Dragoons or Lancers, and the 14th King's Light Dragoons, also called the King's Royal Hussars. The majority of his army was made up by units drawn from the East India Company's own army, namely 4 Indian cavalry regiments, 11 Bengal infantry regiments, and a regiment of European light infantry. This latter was a company regiment, but made up solely of Europeans as opposed to local sepoys. This particular regiment, the 2nd Bengal Light Infantry, would ultimately become the Munster Fusiliers. The cavalry commander, Major General Sir Joseph Thackwell, placed the British and Indian mounted units on each flank, protecting Gough's infantry, which had been divided into 3 divisions. The 1st Division, on the British right, was commanded by Major General Sir Walter Gilbert, a 63-year-old son of Cornwall. Gilbert had been commissioned in the Bengal Army back in 1800 and had spent his entire career on the subcontinent. Meanwhile, the 2nd Division, which was to his left, was commanded by Brigadier General Colin Campbell. The 56-year-old was a veteran of the Peninsular War and would go on to achieve great fame in the 1850s at the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War, where he commanded the famous Thin Red Line, and the Great Indian Revolt. His command consisted of 2 brigades. The first, under Brigadier Hogan, consisted of the 61st Regiment of Foot and 3 regiments of Bengal native infantry. The other, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Pennycook, comprised of the 25th and 45th Bengal native infantry and the subject of this story, the 24th Regiment of Foot. Meanwhile, Brigadier Penny, commanding 3 more regiments of Bengal native infantry, was held in reserve. Deciding that it was too late in the day to launch into a battle, and conscious that his men had been on the march for 3 days, Gough decided to pitch camp, ready to fight the following morning. However, before any tents could be erected, the Sikh cannon opened fire on Gough's army. Never a man to sit around, Gough immediately ordered his guns to respond. The Battle of Chillianwala, 13th of January 1849, had begun. After an hour-long artillery duel, he sent his infantry forward to storm the Sikh batteries at 3 p.m. The 24th Regiment of Foot, along with the 25th and 45th Bengal Native Infantry, were ordered to storm the Sikh artillery positions with bayonets rather than firing their rifles. Foot soldiers relying on bayonets against 20 entrenched artillery pieces. It was an infantry version of the charge of the Light Brigade, only without any war correspondents being present to record it. It so happened that the position that the 24th occupied in that attacking line left them most exposed to the artillery fire, and as they advanced in close formation, struggling through the undergrowth, the British were easy targets for the Sikh gunners, who ripped them to pieces. One young officer, Lieutenant Andrew Macpherson, later recalled that he looked behind him to find that his whole section had disappeared. He charged on towards the cannon alone. The ferocious Sikh barrage, apart from felling many of their number, also acted as an impetus to the men of the 24th. They rushed towards the Sikh guns as fast as they could. After all, better to be hand-to-hand fighting than being blasted to smithereens. The speed of their advance, along with the dense scrub, swiftly separated them from the Indian regiments on either side, and when they finally arrived at the Sikh lines, they were on their own. Nevertheless, despite their depleted numbers, they proceeded to capture one of the batteries and spike the guns. And all this without firing a shot, just bayonets. General Sir Charles Napier later wrote in praise that their conduct has never been surpassed by British soldiers on a field of battle. Be that as it may, the price was incredibly high. The 24th suffered 518 casualties out of their 1,000 men they'd started the day with, a casualty rate of over 50%. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brooks, lay dead, as did 13 more officers and 241 men. Now the Sikhs regrouped and counter-attacked. They drove the exhausted 24th back with heavy casualties, amongst them the brigade commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Pennycook. Mortally wounded about 50 yards from the Sikh battery, he died during that Sikh counter-attack, whilst being defended by his 17-year-old son, who'd recently arrived in India, fresh from Sandhurst. The fighting was vicious. One officer from the 24th, Lieutenant Lloyd Williams, had 23 sword and lance wounds recorded on his body. He also suffered a fractured skull and his left hand was chopped off. Incredibly, he survived, rose to the rank of captain, left the army and lived for another 40 years. Say what you like about Victorian soldiers, but they were as hard as nails. It was now that another disaster struck the 24th. They lost their Queen's colour. Although never seen again, interestingly, the Sikhs never displayed the captured flag, or even claimed that they had captured it. So it seems it fell to the ground in the battle, and was later found by local villagers looting the battlefield, who reused it in garments or something similar. Alternatively, as the British fell back, maybe a soldier had tied it around his tunic in an attempt to save it, had been killed, and unknown to the burial party, had been buried while still wearing it. Nevertheless, it was a disaster for an infantry regiment to lose their colours in action, and it wouldn't be the last time the 24th would lose a colour flag this way. Whilst the Queen's colour was lost, the regimental colour was saved by Private Perry, who came to the rescue after its colour party had been wiped out by the Sikhs. The momentum of the Sikh counterattack forced the two Indian regiments either side of the 24th to fall back as well. They, like their British comrades, also suffered heavy casualties. The 25th Bengal Native Infantry suffered 211 casualties, whilst the 45th lost 79 men killed or wounded. And the two regiments lost 3 of their colours too. Meanwhile, to their left, Hogan's brigade, with Campbell in attendance, were having greater success. Having reached and then broken through the Sikh line, they came face to face with the Sikh cavalry. Incredibly, the 61st Regiment of Foot charged the Sikh mounted warriors and drove them off. The brigade now turned right, capturing 13 guns, before uniting with some of Gilbert's brigade, who'd also broken through the Sikh line from the other direction. All along that front line, confusion reigned, as some British units advanced and others were forced back. On the far left, beyond Campbell's advance, the Sikh irregular Gauchara cavalry moved into position to move behind Hogan's brigade. Seeing the danger, Gough ordered Brigadier White, commanding the British left cavalry, to take them on. White ordered a charge. Whilst the 5th Bengal Light Cavalry hesitated, Captain Unit of the 3rd King's Own Light Dragoons immediately led his squadron, all mounted on greys, through the thick scrub and jungle as fast as the vegetation allowed. Gathering speed, Unit's men thundered through the stunned Sikh cavalry, turned around and galloped back through them again. It became one of the great cavalry charges of the Victorian period, but once more it came at a cost. Of the 106 men who charged, just 48 remained in the saddle by the end of the battle. The farrier of the Galloping Third, a man by the name of Johnson, was accompanied into the charge by his pet dog, Albert. When Johnson was killed, the loyal dog stayed by his master's body for 2 days until it was buried. The cavalry charge over on the right flank would also be remembered, but for all the wrong reasons. Over there, Colonel Alexander Pope, commanding the British Right Cavalry, also moved forward towards the Sikh lines. A veteran with 40 years' service in India, Pope was now in his 60s, infirm and nearly blind. He needed 2 troopers to even help him mount his horse, and after some confusion, he managed to line his men up in regiments, with the 14th King's Light Dragoons on the left, the 1st and 6th Bengal Light Cavalry in the centre, and the 9th Lancers on the right, supported by the Bengal Horse Artillery. Having finally managed to get all his command facing in the right direction, he now ordered his men forward at the trot. Suddenly through the jungle, they saw the massed ranks of the Sikh cavalry advancing towards them. What happened next is not quite clear. Some people believed that Pope panicked and ordered a retreat. Others claimed that he shouted, "Three's right," but the order was misheard as "three's about." Whilst others claimed that the Bengal cavalry units halted and then simply turned tail. Whichever is true, and historians will never 100% know as Pope was killed in the resulting debacle, the Bengal cavalry was swiftly joined by the 2 British cavalry regiments galloping wildly in retreat. Their sudden departure left the Bengal horse artillery totally unprotected, and as they hastened to relimber their guns, the Sikh cavalry swept down on them, overrunning the battery and capturing the cannon. The lack of cavalry protection on Gough's right flank now left the infantry under Colonel Godby dangerously exposed. The 70th Bengal Native Infantry desperately had to hold off a determined cavalry charge from their Sikh opponents, and in the end it was only the rapid arrival of Colonel Penny's reserves, consisting of 3 regiments of sepoys, that saved them from destruction. Meanwhile, the fleeing cavalry raced back into the village of Chillianwala, where an army chaplain of all people, the Reverend Walter Whiting, halted their retreat and regrouped them. Gough was so impressed with Reverend Whiting's less than spiritual intervention that he wanted to promote him to a bishop, until he was told that the appointment of bishops was not in the gift of British Army generals. The confused battle with the front line all over the place petered out in the darkness at around 8 p.m. The Sikh Army withdrew from the field, fully expecting to resume the battle the following day. That too was the expectation of General Gough, who fell back on the village of Chillianwala. However, overnight heavy rain began to fall, continuing throughout the next day. Thanks to the weather, there had been no immediate resumption in the battle, and Sher Singh withdrew his army from the battlefield, although not before recovering 28 of his 40 abandoned guns under the cover of darkness. The British claimed that many of their wounded were also dispatched by Sikh soldiers and irregulars in that same darkness. Who knows? And in an era long before the Geneva Convention, could you really blame the Sikhs if they had? So, who won the Battle of Chillianwala? It's hard to determine if anyone really won. Gough claimed victory, but then he always did, claiming that the Sikhs had lost 4,000 men, compared to his losses of just 2,300 killed and wounded. The Sikhs claimed that they had won, as Gough had retreated back to the village of Chillianwala, conveniently forgetting that they too had withdrawn from the battlefield once they realised there wasn't going to be a part 2. Back in Britain, both the press and politicians were not so convinced by Gough's claims. What they saw was his casualty figures of nearly 2,300 killed and wounded, nearly a fifth of his army, and they were shocked that nearly 1,000 of Gough's casualties had been regular British soldiers, something almost unheard of in her colonial wars. Didn't feel like a victory, especially as Sher Singh's army was still very much at large. Public confidence, not least in Gough, the victor of the First Anglo Sikh War, was shaken. In fact, the East India Company was so convinced that Chillianwala was no victory and that the losses were so costly that within 48 hours of the news of the battle arriving in London, they had decided to replace old Gough with General Sir Charles Napier. However, with all the communications by ship, that news was weeks old, and by the time they decided to replace the old commander, Gough had secured a decisive victory. And that victory, and Gujarat, would be the subject of a future episode. As an aside, That huge loss of regular British troops would have longer-term results too. Across India, people sat up and took note that the British redcoats were not invincible. Moreover, they could suffer serious losses against Indians in battle. And that message would be remembered by rebelling sepoys and others less than 10 years later. The Battle of Chillianwala saw the 24th Foot conduct an infantry version of the charge of the Light Brigade, advancing with bayonets against entrenched cannon. The result had been equally as devastating. Over 500 of their regiment killed or wounded, including their commanding officer, and the loss of their Queen's colour. After their bruising battles with the Sikhs, the 24th spent some time in India, where they were presented with a new Queen's colour, before being brought back to Britain and Ireland, followed by postings to Malta and Gibraltar, before being sent to South Africa in 1875. In the meantime, a second battalion of the regiment had been raised in 1858 and had arrived in South Africa in 1878. Usual policy in two battalion regiments was to have one stationed at home and the other abroad. However, the growing demands of Queen Victoria's empire meant that it was not uncommon to find both battalions serving abroad. But what was rare was for both battalions to be serving together. And thus it was that the officers and men of the two battalions were excited to be operating together as a regiment in the forthcoming campaign against the Zulus. In December 1878, the officers of the regiment attended a dinner in the mess tent of the 1st Battalion to commemorate that fateful day at Chillianwala. There, looking forward to the campaign against the Zulus, two officers proposed a toast: that we may not get into such a bloody mess, and have better luck this time. Less than a month later, those two officers and over 500 of their men lay dead on the grassy slopes of Isandlwana mountain, and both the regimental and Queen's colours of the 2nd Battalion had been lost. At least the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion would be saved by Lieutenants Melville and Coghill, and B Company of the 2nd Battalion would be awarded 7 Victoria Crosses for their part in the gallant defence of the mission station at Rorke's Drift. In the early 1880s, the 24th were redesignated the South Wales Borderers. Bearing that new name, they would fight at Gallipoli during the First World War, and later in that same war, in 1917, the 2nd Battalion came off the front line on the Western Front, with just 2 officers, a doctor, and 78 men left. In World War II, one battalion was captured at Tobruk, and another involved in the disastrous Norwegian campaign, where the ship carrying them struck a rock and sank. It's a heck of a record. Almost wiped out by the Zulus, surrendering to the Americans, twice to the French, losing 3 regimental colours, losing over 40% of their men at Talavera, and over half in both the War of Jenkins Ear and, of course, in the Bayonet Charge against the cannon at Chillianwala. Maybe the 24th Regiment and their successors really were the unluckiest regiment in the British Army. What do you think? Now you can watch my other videos which involve the 24th Foot, such as some of my stories about the Anglo-Zulu Wars. Or alternatively, how about finding out more about the Sikh Wars? A big thanks to all the members of my YouTube Supporters Club and my patrons too. Details of how you can join them supporting me are in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.